It's great to welcome to the program today Ted Conover, who's an author practicing immersion writing as well as director of NYU's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. I've actually recommended one or two of Ted's books to my audience in the past. Ted, I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for talking to me.
So there are a lot of people in my audience who may not immediately know what we mean by immersion writing and some of the work that you've done in advance, sometimes for years before you will write a book. Certainly Newjack, where you actually became a correctional officer in order to tell the story of what that's like. In Coyotes, you actually travel across the U.S.-Mexico border with undocumented immigrants and even subsequently work with them in multiple places in the United States. So first, to just kind of frame it, when you start a project like this, what's the genesis of an idea? How do you think about your relationship to the subject matter and start thinking about how you'll carry the project out?
Sure. I guess you could say my approach is to try to go more in depth than a regular journalist can. I look for a subject that matters to people. Maybe it's mass incarceration, maybe it's immigration, undocumented immigration, or homelessness. And I think, okay, what have journalists and others been able to do to cast light on this topic? And what could I do if I were willing to spend more time and get closer, get my hands dirty if needed? And often the answer has been I try to go beyond the sort of interview a journalist does, right? Asking the 5 Ws and all that, and spend time living with somebody else or doing what they do. So my first book is about railroad tramps, and I was still an undergraduate in college and rode the rails. I met Mexicans while doing that, and using my high school Spanish, realized they would talk to me, and in fact, seemed open to it, and it seemed open to me hanging out. And that became my second book, called Coyotes, which you mentioned. And then, yeah, when I moved to New York from Colorado, gosh, 20 years ago, mass incarceration was all over the news, as it is again today. And I thought, there's got to be a way to get closer to the subject than just, calling up people on the phone or doing interviews. And I ended up applying for a job as a New York State corrections officer, which took about 3 years to get. And then I worked at Sing Sing almost a year for that book. And the idea is, yeah, I get closer. I'm not a standard journalist keeping my distance. I'm right in there, and sometimes distance is good. It lets you be a little more objective, but I tend to get subjective. I say, I'm a CO. I'm scared of this situation, or I'm a CO. The guys around me are angry, and today I understand it. I feel kind of angry myself, and so I try to take notes on what it feels like to be there.
In the book Newjack, and also in some of the research I did preparing for the interview, you talk about the perception that could have been the one that your coworkers at Sing Sing came away with when they learned about the fact that you were researching and ultimately wrote a book about your experience there, that they might be mad at you. They might not like the fact that you essentially, to call it's not a ruse in the sense that you really did go through the training. You really did work there. Nobody knew, you weren't treated differently because there was this book coming at the end of the experience, but that maybe you took advantage in some way that is not okay, or that they would in some way be displeased with the fact that you were there not just as a correctional officer, but also as a writer.
For sure.
What was, what is there a fair critique to be made that you were sort of using the resources of training in order to end up writing a book? Or do you find that not to be a fair critique?
Well, you've asked a couple of questions. That last one is, did I, somehow take advantage of the resources of the state of New York just to just to be able to write something about it. And in fact, I stayed on the job longer than the typical trainee does. Most
Hmm.
people drop out before I did, and I stuck with it. So I think New York State got their value from me. I was a good employee. I got good job ratings. I tried really hard to be a good corrections officer and understand what that meant. Um, that's one of two projects uh, which you could call undercover because I could not tell people my uh, full background or my real agenda, which was to write something about this. The other time I did that, I became a USDA meat inspector at a beef plant in Nebraska, and that was secretive too. And if you do something in a secretive way, you are deceptive, and deception is best avoided in journalism. But there are times when, in order to do something important, I think deception is warranted. Not all journalists agree, but there was no other way I could understand the life of an officer, a guard at Sing Sing, without doing that job. I had previously actually gotten an assignment from the New Yorker to write about COs upstate, and then the state wouldn't let me go to work with them. They would let me visit a single prison once for a short guided tour, but this is a big deal. It's corrections is the second largest employer in New York State, or was when I was a CO. And how do you justify keeping the public out? So I felt justified in getting the job secretly. And then, every journalist faces a moment of reckoning when what they've written comes out, or what they've produced on video. The subjects like it or they don't, and they say it's true or they say that's BS. It's not really different when you've done something undercover. People you write about are still either going to say that's BS, or they're going to say, yeah, well, actually, that's true. And far and away, COs said that book is true. It's warts and all. We don't look good in the whole thing, but I got credit for doing the job myself and for telling the truth about it. Most angry was the state of New York, which put out a press release urging aggrieved employees to sue me if they felt I had injured them somehow. And I think the people who felt injured were the state corrections bureaucrats who felt I'd snuck into their prisons and talked about it, which I wasn't supposed to do.
One of the things in Newjack that comes out, which I think couldn't possibly have come out if you were just interviewing people, is the sort of many sides of the prototypical correctional officer, in the sense that there's often conflict about their views of the system. There's conflict about the views on even individual inmates, as some of the stories that you tell. What else was only possible in the telling of that story because you were immersed as a correctional officer, that by interviewing people simply could not have been part of the story?
I'm really happy you brought up that example, because to me, that is what this approach lets me do, is look at a big fat stereotype, like the guard as brute or the guard as sadist, and think and ask out loud, how much of that is true? And you're right. I found in some cases, gosh, that guy's pretty bad. But in lots of other cases, in fact, in most cases, what I found was human beings trying to keep something good in themselves alive while being immersed in this negative environment day after day after day. Like, it's a crummy job. It brings out the worst in them. It brought out the worst in me. As my wife observed, it showed her my inner disciplinarian, which I had actually never tried to cultivate. But that's kind of what the job asks you to do, is say no all day long to your fellow human beings. So the to get to your question more particularly, working at Sing Sing put me in a group of officers of color. And there's no way I could have learned the things I learned about their lives otherwise. I remember the day I'm talking to the crew I worked with in B Block. It's this giant housing block, more than 600 prisoners. We had like 15 minutes outside the mess hall before we had to start frisking prisoners. And a guy named Alcantara, who's Dominican and lives near New York City, described double parking outside his mom's building because she was moving. And he had his minivan, and he ran inside her lobby to pick something up. And as he's running out, undercover officers, thinking he's part of a drug deal, tackle him.
Mm.
And I heard a version of this story like 6 different times. These are officers of color I work with who are being pulled over by police on traffic stops, or they're being stopped by undercovers in Harlem because they are people of color. And that makes a big impression, you know? And I wouldn't have been able to tell stories like that had I not done the job myself.
One of the things that I took away from it in hearing, you describe in the book kind of your personality transformation as you describe, and your wife dealing with it, is that maybe there really is more to this idea that the focus on individuals in systems, even now, like with the unrest and protests that we are seeing, the focus on individuals is relevant because people are people as individuals, but we shouldn't ignore the effect that systems have. And that was a really big takeaway for me.
Yeah, the system makes you act a certain way. Let's say you are a person convicted of a crime who has had friends of different races. You know, you're from a place where it was cool making friends who didn't look like you. Well, you go into prison, and that stuff doesn't fly in a lot of prisons. You have to stick with your own kind. Prisons are racially polarized, and then they're ideologically polarized, and they're organized by gang, and so prisoners, inmates, have to act a certain way. And then so do officers. Let's say I'm an officer who thinks it's okay to have a conversation with a prisoner, like just, how was
Which
your
you
weekend?
did. I mean, that was something you described. Yeah.
I thought, well, that's a good idea, right? That's how you manage people. You talk to them. There's a whole bunch of officers who think that's a terrible idea, that you're gonna get a reputation as the inmate's friend, right? A guy who won't uphold the rules. And in fact, there were some cases like that where some officers were just too friendly, and you think, whoa, what's that about? Because a certain distance is appropriate. But yeah, you're in this system where your uniform defines how you interact with other people. And you're one of a group of people, whether you're a prisoner or an officer, you're one of a group, and you have to act in accordance with the standards of that group. And when I see officers now standing shoulder to shoulder to repel demonstrators, I'm always thinking, okay, how many of them are spoiling for a fight? Because you can tell some of them are, right? All of their hearts are beating, bum, 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 bum. They're like, okay, when's it going to start? How long can I restrain myself? Who's going to stick up for me if a rock hits me in the head? But then, there's a whole bunch of them who are like, oh my God, let me just get home in one piece and back to my family and my toddler. And right. I didn't really sign up to be in a riot. And but how are those people going to act when it comes to violence? How will they respond to their training with restraint? Will they respond to their their ancient brain and start firing a weapon or flailing with a gun. The the whole question of how you act when you're a law enforcement officer and part of a group that's under stress is super important and matters so much today. And yeah, so that's kind of the thing I wanted to find out about.
Let's pause the conversation there on our podcast, but we'll have the full conversation with Ted on our YouTube channel. So I'd like to talk a little bit about your experience in that you describe in Coyotes, which I most recently read. Now, the book, correct me if I'm wrong, it was published in '86, but it contains things you did in the early to mid '80s. Is that roughly accurate?
Yes. Well, actually, it would be late '80s. It would be.
Now I don't remember. I thought it was, well, in any case, it was somewhere in the mid to late '80s. It was certainly some time ago. A lot of things about immigration to the United States have changed since then. But what I was struck by was, so I'm an immigrant to the U.S. from Argentina, but I am white and I came early enough where I don't speak accented English. And I certainly had a very different experience than the guys you and occasionally women that you spent time with. What was most striking to me from the book was the degree to which you were like them in as far as the people you interacted with in so many ways. In other words, as far as people knew, economically indistinguishable, going to work in Arizona at the citrus farm and collecting oranges and at one point lemons, I believe it was. But yet, at almost every interaction, you were often treated differently, just on the basis that you did stand out in the way that you were a white American guy, and there was no getting rid of that. As immersed as you were, that you couldn't get rid of.
No, and I like to blend in and connect on the basis of things I have in common with people, but with that book, there's no way I'm going to pass as a Mexican migrant. I never even entertained the thought I could. That said, I had just finished this project where I traveled for 4 months on freight trains with mostly American-born transient people, and there was I had a lot of fear in that experience because a lot of them, have their issues. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of addiction. With the Mexicans I traveled with, that was not the case. These are mostly childhood friends from a little valley in Querétaro, northwest of Mexico City, who they're like whole people, and they're my age. And it was, by and large, I had a great time with them, and they looked out for me. They weren't, I connected with a farm workers group in Arizona, and they felt that they needed to do right by me by looking after me. So I've got to say, of all the different groups of people I've hung out with, that was the most fun, because they were guys my age. When you're done with a day of work, you have a few beers. You're thinking a lot of the same thoughts, and I'm still in touch with a whole bunch of them, including that woman, Evangelica, who accompanied our group of 17 people across the border into Arizona and then up to Idaho. And she's back home, and a bunch of others found me on Facebook, which is pretty cool.
So there's so much about that book that is so relevant today. But for me, if I were to recommend it to someone today, given what's going on, with coronavirus and questions about which workers are essential and which are not, and the supply chain of food and agriculture in the United States, what would be just incredible if more people understood would be not just, as you describe, picking oranges up on ladders where you carry the ladder and then you put the huge bag and then you're throwing these oranges into the bag, which gets heavier and heavier as you're on the ladder, just bag after bag after bag. So there's the hard work of Just you go and you buy navel oranges at $1.50 a pound. Everything that went into that, first of all. But the story you tell about how much work went in to get that job. And this is not an endorsement or attack on crossing a border you're not authorized to cross. It's merely the empirical reality that, you tell the story that starts in the mountains of Mexico and takes bus rides and other altercations merely to get to the border, a multi-day trip through the desert. This is all just to get a job that many of us don't even understand. That seems so relevant today. And it's just not part of most people's understanding of what we mean when we say undocumented workers.
I got to tell you, it sure instilled in me respect for immigrants who want to come here to work, to better themselves. Things were different in the 80s, as you mentioned, insofar as, it was mostly agricultural workers at the time, mostly men, mostly from rural parts of Mexico, the poorest parts. It's a more diverse group now who work in all kinds of jobs. And among them, there's no denying, are a few bad apples. But overall, the people I met made me proud to be part of a country built on immigration. A country populated by people who chose to come here to make something of themselves. And that spirit was so clear in the people I worked with, who, by the way, could work so much harder than me. I felt like such a wuss, complaining after a day of picking lemons that my hand hurt from the clippers or my shoulder hurt from that heavy bag. And they like, ha, Americans are so soft.
Well, I mean, along those lines, the jobs that I'm trying to think. So you did the citrus part of it. At remind me which other, because I know that sometimes you were visiting places, but you weren't working, like the potato farm in Idaho. What other jobs did you work with them?
Yeah, well, that was the most extended job I had. And the rest of the time I was mostly traveling. I
Right.
tried to get a job with a crew of cement workers in Houston and called the boss. They had his number and they said, yeah, we're going to go to Houston. And this guy, Terry, he'll give you a job. And I'm like, oh, well, let's see. And when he heard an American on the line say that I wanted a job too, and he said, have you ever done it? And I said, no, but I'm a hard worker. They'll tell you. And he goes, oh, I think I just prefer to work with the Mexicans. Obviously, that's not good, right? I'm an American citizen. I shouldn't be locked out. But again, that's the kind of story you can tell if you've put yourself out there. So that's what I wanted to do.
That also is, by the way, a reminder of when these conversations happen about, quote, dealing with undocumented immigration, the focus on the individuals rather than the employers seems misguided in a sense. And it sounds like the cement boss that you're talking about is a smaller employer, but there are very large corporations that regularly are doing the hiring of undocumented labor with essentially no risk. I mean, sure, it's in the law that you're not supposed to do it, but by and large, the large corporations are not the ones being punished for that.
No, right. In fact, for many years after I finished writing Coyotes, it was not a crime to hire undocumented people, only a crime for them to do the work. So that kind of explained things right there.
We've been speaking with Ted Conover, author who practices immersion writing. I've most recently read Newjack and Coyotes of his work. Ted, I so appreciate your time, and I've really enjoyed reading your books, and just thank you so much for talking to me today.
David, it's a pleasure. Thank you.